Hello, my name is Gil Penalosa, and this is Cities for Everyone, the webinar. Every other Tuesday, I invite fascinating people from around the world to share experiences and knowledge that will help us create affordable, equitable, and sustainable cities. I was born in Bogota, Colombia, where as commissioner I led the design and construction of over 200 parks and took a small program called Ciclovia, Open Streets, and increased it to over 120 kilometers, 75 miles of car-free streets every Sunday and holiday, where more than 1 million people walk, bike, run, shop, enjoying the presence of each other. 17 years ago, I created 880 Cities, a non-profit organization based in Toronto, Canada, where I live. Last year, I ran for mayor and came second with 100,000 votes. My aim was to change the conversation in creating a Toronto for everyone. I've been fortunate to have worked in over 350 cities in all continents, sharing and learning. Based on all experiences, I develop master classes and keynotes customized to each city. But Cities for Everyone, the webinar, is a way of giving back. It's always free and hopefully always interesting. Please invite others to join us every other Tuesday, anyone who cares about cities and people, equity and sustainability, about all living older, healthier, and happier. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cities for Everyone, the webinar, where every week we try to have fascinating topics with interesting people as guests. Today, the topic is very important. Charles Brown is going to be talking about arrested mobility, how in the US is being over-policed against Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. But this is not just about the US. This is a topic that is important to people from anywhere, because where there is an issue of race or ethnicity or any other type of minority, we need to be equitable. We need really for all people to be equal. But before we can be equal, we need to have equity. Charles, thank you very much. And we are very much looking forward to your presentation.
It's good to see you, and congratulations on your honor in for your doctoral degree. Is well deserved. And you know how much I appreciate you. So it's good to see you again. I'm Charles T. Brown. I'm founder and CEO of Equitable Cities. Also part of the adjunct faculty at the Edward J. Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy. I currently reside in Somerset, New Jersey. However, I'm originally from a small town, a town of less than 500 people in rural Mississippi. My experience includes over 20 plus years in urban planning, public policy, and research. If you want to kind of sum up who I am, I believe in a philosophy, I am because we are. And so I do this work out of my respect and appreciation for humanity. So arrested mobility, the impact of over-policing BIPOC mobility in the United States. Again, I'm Charles T. Brown, founder and CEO of Equitable Cities. If you would like to learn more about arrested mobility, please visit arrestedmobility.com, where you'll find more information about the topic as well as the podcast. So to begin, there are a lot of conversations out there about equity. And what I want to do really quickly here is get us on the same page regarding what I view as equity. To me, equity is the guarantee of fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement, while at the same time striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. The principle of equity, though, acknowledges that there are historically underserved and underrepresented populations, and that fairness regarding these unbalanced conditions is needed to assist equality in the provision of effective opportunities to all groups. So with that being said, in short, equity simply involves trying to understand and give people what they need to enjoy full, healthy lives. However, regardless as to where I go in the world, What people start to push back on in terms of the concept of equity is not giving people what they need to enjoy full, healthy lives, but instead equity being the presence of justice and fairness within the procedures, the processes, and the distribution of resources by institutions or systems. They push back even more when we state that in order to do equity work, it requires an understanding of the underlying or the root causes of inequalities and oppression within our society. Put plainly, equity work involves more than a desktop exercise. Because once you have an understanding of the underlying or root causes of inequality and oppression within our society, more than not, it leads you to racial equity. And what is racial equity? Racial equity is about transforming the behaviors, the institutions, and the systems that disproportionately harm people of color. It's about increasing access to power, redistributing and providing additional resources, and most importantly, eliminating the barriers to opportunity in order to empower low-income communities of color to thrive and reach their full potential. Lastly, racial equity is about encouraging racial equity or encouraging it is not about excluding other marginalized groups, as is often discussed. In fact, we understand that equity impacts intersect and compound with other identities such as gender, sexual orientation, ability, and disability, and et cetera. And so what's the current context? Why are we talking about arrested mobility here today? And why have I been spending the past several years discussing it? Well, I'm discussing it because there are a plethora of federal, state, and local initiatives, plans, policies, and programs aimed justly at increasing physical activity and improving pedestrian and bicycle safety and mobility for Black people and other people in the US and around the world. These programs that are great include Vision Zero, Complete Streets, Open Streets, Livable Streets, Safe Streets, and Streets for Streets' Sake. All great programs. However, when we apply a very critical equity-based and inclusive-based lens to these programs, what we actually find is that few of them actually achieve their goal of removing barriers to people being more physically active. And that is specifically for Black people and other marginalized groups. So what then are the challenges that are associated with these programs or the ways in which they can be enhanced? Well, what we know is that often the shortcomings include the fact that they are ahistorical and apolitical. The current description, particularly in regards to the history of systemic and institutional racism within the US, sort of ignores the historic and the political nature of these policies, these programs, et cetera. Secondly, what we find is discriminatory law enforcement. These strategies do not highlight the role of state and municipal law enforcement in discouraging and denying physical activity among BIPOC populations. Thirdly, there are no tangible organizational commitments to the degree that is needed. What we find is that equitable and inclusive access is listed as a foundational element, but not explicitly as a desired outcome or goal with any tangible organizational commitments to funding organizations that work with and in Black communities. Fourthly, we find that there is no mention of the overwhelming data highlighting the magnitude of the unconscious bias and the criminalization of Blackness or otherness in America, particularly in light of the current climate. Fifthly, we find that the strategies do not specifically discuss the need for intentional or institutional changes, particularly around increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion internally as well as externally, nor do they hold their partners responsible for doing so as well. And so what we hear oftentimes, especially as you engage with the health community as I do, is that these then are social determinants of health. Well, I'm here to tell you these are not social determinants of health. These are political determinants of health. And how do I know so? Because a Black man here in America or a Black man here in the world, what I've experienced and what my community continues to experience is the fact that our mobility has been arrested. You might ask, what is arrested mobility? Arrested mobility is my assertion that Black people, as well as other minorities, have been historically and presently denied by both legal and illegal authority the inalienable right to move, to be moved, or to simply exist in public space. This unfortunately has led or resulted in adverse social, political, economic, and environmental health effects that are widespread and intergenerational. But they are preventable, which is why we're here, which is why Gil is here, which is why you all are here. We are optimistic about the future, but we must deal with the present reality of arrested mobility. You might ask, is there a framework for arrested mobility? As shown here, arrested mobility is a direct manifestation of racism across four distinct realms of racism. The first one being the public realm, the personal realm. The second, the interpersonal realm. The third, the institutional realm. And the fourth, the cultural realm. These collective realms of racism have resulted in what we know to be the social construct of race, both locally as well as globally, and has thus led to the intentional and sometimes deliberate targeting and over-policing of Black people here in America as well as around the globe. This includes their physical mobility, of which there's a direct relationship, and their social or upward mobility, of which there's an indirect relationship. And for all the other social scientists here, please note and understand that I also understand that the direct relationship between the variables shown here are much more complex and nuanced than displayed. So you might ask then, how are Black people, BIPOC people, and their communities over police? Well, over policing is evident via three distinct forms of over policing. Basically, in order to see the policing, I argue that you have to reconceptualize or reimagine what policing is. I redefine policing in the context of arrested mobility via 3 or 4 Ps. The first one being policy. And as an example of that, you look to racialized zoning, racial residential segregation, even disinvestment in communities. The second one being policing, or better yet, law enforcement at the federal, the state, and the local level. The third one isn't as obvious, but they're all tied together, and that is the self-deputization of non-Black citizens, in particular, what we call or refer to as polity. So in the context of physical mobility being arrested, the various degrees of over-policing impacts of Black people are evident and overwhelming, and there's a multitude of data to support this. And so you asked then, where is this evidence to support arrested mobility across the different modes of transportation? That's the sort of focus of the presentation today, just strictly on the modes of transportation, but we also know it exists outside of transportation as well. But for the sake of this conversation, I'll focus on transportation. Let's start with walking. In the case of arrested mobility, some of the most notable cases of over-policing walking include the case of Ahmaud Arbery, who was doing what? Walking or running when he was killed. Trayvon Martin, who was also doing what? Walking when he was killed. And then lastly, Mike Brown. The question becomes, how were each of these individuals killed or murdered? Well, two were killed via self-deputized citizens, one was killed by the police. But the question is there data to support arrested mobility? Well, yes, an analysis of 5 years of tickets issued to pedestrians in Jacksonville, Florida, in the Southeast, parts of the US, revealed that 55% of the tickets were issued to Black individuals, even though only 29% of the total population identified as Black. In that same study, they found that Blacks were 3 times more likely to receive a ticket than whites. And in fact, residents of that city's 3 poor zip codes were about 6 times as likely to receive a pedestrian citation. And if you're looking for an example of the ways in which arrested mobility plays out and how Black and brown people are yet charged as a result of the built environment being conducive to safe walking and running, please take a look at the case of Raquel Nelson, who was a Black single mother and college student who lost her son in a hit and run while crossing the street to their apartment. I'm here to let you know that though she was charged, the man who actually killed her son was later found and admitted to drinking and taking painkillers on the night he killed Raquel's son. If you have not heard of the case of Raquel Nelson, please Google it now. But in the case of arrested mobility, I wish it ended at walking and running. Unfortunately, it does not. It also moves into cycling or bicycling. And around the US and around the world, there are more than a dozen studies and reports on over-policing Black mobility via biking here as well as globally. I've been behind many of these reports. In fact, I've authored a number of them, a number of articles on this issue. But some of the more recent ones that I can point you to includes the topic of biking while Black in Chicago, which was done by the Chicago Tribune. And in that particular study, what they found is that not a single majority white area ranked in the top 10 for bicycle tickets, despite biking's popularity in white areas such as Whitetown and Lincoln Park in the city of Chicago. But what does the data say? Well, when we look at the data, let's go to Tampa, Florida here again in the Southeast. What we find is that between 2003 and 2015, Tampa police issued over 10,000 bicycle tickets. 79% of those tickets were issued to Blacks, though only 26% of Tampa's population identifies as Black. In fact, during that 12-year study period, at least 142 bicycle tickets were issued to kids aged 15 and under, including children as young as 3 years old. When we go out west in Oakland, California, 60% of all bicycle stops included Black cyclists, though the city of Oakland's population is only about 25%. We find in Chicago, going to the Midwest, twice as many bicycle citations are written in majority Black neighborhoods than in majority white or Latino neighborhoods. In fact, 321 bicycle tickets were issued in Austin, which is a low-income majority Black neighborhood in Chicago, whereas only 5 were issued in Lincoln Park, a majority or a wealthy majority white community. This is surprising to anyone who has gone to the city of Chicago because you're much more likely to see a non-Black person walking and biking, I should say biking, than you are a Black person. But in the case of arrested mobility, I wish it ended at walking or biking, but it doesn't. It also includes the most recent and notable cases of the murders of Philando Castile and Sandra Bland, and then even more recently, unfortunately, Tyree Nichols in Memphis, Tennessee. But you might ask, are there data to support arrested mobility in the context of driving? Yes, when we look at a nationwide quantitative analysis of policing trends in traffic stops, they show that Black and Hispanic drivers are stopped disproportionately to white drivers, even though the hit rate of white and Black drivers are similar. Police are also less likely to pull over Black drivers at the dusk when the race of a driver is less obvious to police. And then when we go to Minnesota, which has received a tremendous amount of attention due to George Floyd and other things that have happened there, a state commission study found that Blacks and Latinos were 7 times more likely to be stopped by police in white majority neighborhoods. In fact, in 2016, 47% of the arrests by a local police department, that being the St. Anthony Police Department there, were Black individuals, even though the patrolled area is only about 7% Black. But in the case of arrested mobility, I wish it ended at walking and biking, at using and in driving, but it doesn't. It also goes to public transit. And one of the most recent or notable cases there includes the murder of Oscar Grant III, who's a 22-year-old Black man murdered by BART police officers in Oakland, California. But what does the data say around public transportation? Well, a Marshall Project analysis of the New York Division of Criminal Justice Services data found in 2014 showed that while the number of turnstile arrests have decreased significantly, what has not changed is who gets arrested. 89% of those arrested are Black or Hispanic. The top 10 neighborhoods in New York with the highest number of arrests per subway swipe were all predominantly Black or Hispanic as well. And if you're looking for a case on that, go to Adrian Napier, a Black teenager who was tackled and aimed at by 10 police officers for fare evasion. The fare was only $2.75. In 2017, Blacks were 8 times more likely than whites to be charged for certain transit violations in Portland, Oregon. Thankfully, they later decriminalized that. That's the goal of arrested mobility, to get other locations to decriminalize or repeal these policies as well. But in the case of arrested mobility, I wish it ended there. Unfortunately, it does not. It also includes ride sharing. And here I'm going to share with you some data from Stanford, MIT, and the University of Washington, who found that ride sharing drivers discriminate based on race and gender. Here's the data on that. What we found is that of the 581 app hailing trips recorded, Black travelers waited on average 20% longer than white travelers to have their ride accepted on Lyft or Uber. A scary fact is that on average, female travelers were driven 5% further than males, given the same start and finish location. And regardless as to how I've been dressed in society, whether in a suit or a hoodie, I've experienced, as have other minorities, the fact that you can call for a cab and at some point have it refused. And 55% of Blacks who have called for a cab at some point have experienced a refusal by the service to send a cab to their community. But in the case of arrested mobility, it doesn't end there. It also includes the case of Breonna Taylor and Tamir Rice, simply existing either in public space or in the privacy of their own homes. So you might ask then, what are the adverse social, political, economic, environmental, and health outcomes of this? Well, what we find is that Blacks are 54% less likely to be physically active than whites, and that's regardless of their neighborhood or individual income level. Areas with larger Black populations tend to have lower rates of upward mobility. They're also disproportionately associated with food deserts, which are made even worse by a lack of access to transportation options. And then lastly, what we find is that this segregation discernibly affects their educational attainment, which hurts their ability to move upward in society. We then find that they consistently have less access to important resources and opportunities like healthcare, supermarket, education, and jobs. And then from a political standpoint, this transportation disadvantage makes Black people more vulnerable to disenfranchisement efforts like a lower density of polling places, which then exacerbates the lack of representation in government. So at this point, you might be wondering, what is it that we can do? Well, in addition to addressing arrested mobility, I need many of you to develop a new justice framework, the way in which you go about assessing what is happening in your community. It starts with the theory of recognition justice, asking the question, have you considered the damage inflicted by a lack of recognition and misrecognition in your town? It takes us to the need for distributive justice, which is concerned with the fair allocation of resources among diverse members of your community, thus asking the question, who has physical access to that street, to that park, or to that trail? Which takes us to the need for procedural justice, asking the question, who has influence over the design, the operations, and the programming of these spaces? Because procedural justice speaks to the idea of fair processes and how people's perception of fairness is strongly impacted by the quality of their experience. Which takes us to interactional justice. What makes people feel welcomed or unwanted in a space? See, interactional justice is the degree to which the people affected by the decision are treated with dignity and respect, which takes us to representational justice. Collectively, as well as individually here, we have a responsibility to elevate the voices historically oppressed by privilege. So it forces you to ask the question, do people feel their experience in history is represented in the space? Which lastly takes us to restorative justice. Restorative justice is a proactive policy approach to preventing harm and conflict within transportation and mobility, if applied. And what we need to do in the context of restorative justice is ask the question, to what degree have you and others rectified injustices arising from these decisions? And many of you here and others around the world are all saying, Charles, we get it. We're in the same boat. No, we're not in the same boat. We're in the same storm. And that is a huge difference. So the reason I'm asking you to do this work here today and to join Gil and others like us around the world is because in particular, Black people are tired. And we're tired because we can't go jogging. We can't ask for help after being in a car crash. We can't walk home from the corner store. We can't walk home with Skittles. We can't get a normal traffic ticket. We can't be a 10-year-old walking with our grandmother. We can't run. We can't breathe. We can't live. Rest in peace, Tyree Nichols, because just like yours, my grandmother's mobility is arrested, my sister's mobility is arrested, and in many ways, my mobility is arrested. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for all the work that you're doing to unarrest the mobility of Black and brown people around the world. And I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Charles, thank you very much. What a great presentation. You were so clear on basic issues, such as it's becoming difficult, threatening to even walk for people of certain race or ethnicity or different backgrounds. And this has to stop immediately. And you show back with data from big cities and small cities, cities where Blacks are majority and cities where it's very minority. And this is happening across. And also that this is not just a US issue, but it has impact all over the world. And it wasn't just about walking, it's also riding bicycles, using public transit, taxis, Uber, Lyft, even just being in public places. And Charles, I want to tell you that while you were speaking, there was a city councilor who wrote on the chat that she wants to take the recording and share it with the city council. And I think that's a really, really good practice. Anytime that anyone thinks that these videos, the recording that is available 2 days after the session, is good for someone, please share it. This arrested mobility, this issue of how it's over-policing Black, Indigenous, and other people of color is a very important topic that should be shared widely by everyone. Charles, thank you very much. I want to thank you not only for being here, for your effort and your work all over the place, bringing the message about how bad things are, but also how much they can improve. Thank you.